Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of the team. It's really an incredible pleasure to be here. It's an incredible pleasure to follow this amazing lineup of contributors to this conference, and not an easy act to follow. I must say that there's so many, the kind of sophistication with which so many of the threads that really fall under the rubric of material flows has been incredible, and I'm incredibly inspired. And I think the thing that is interesting coming at this moment of the conference is that a lot has already been said that really lays a foundation and that really is, I think, kind of something that we took for granted in this project, non-extractive architecture, and so it's really helpful to be able to kind of tug on those, maybe just like expand a few of these threads a little bit more, while having had them already articulated so well. So I think what I wanted to, maybe I'll just say a few words about Space Caviar, and Andrew already said a little bit, but I think maybe what's useful for you to know is we consider ourselves an architecture studio, but we put research at kind of front and center of our work as architects, and that's not to say that we don't do built work, that we don't produce kind of material flows ourselves, but we try to only do that when we feel that it's somehow articulating some of the themes that we're interested in reflecting on through our research. So we try to use ourselves almost as guinea pigs to really experiment with this idea of how we could think of architecture through a new lens, how we could try putting forward a new paradigm. And in that sense, I think this project, non-extractive architecture, is really you could describe it as kind of the outcome or the accumulation, build-up of many years of reflection on the state of architecture today. Andrew mentioned that I'm creative director at Design Academy Eindhoven, and I'd like to acknowledge that in many ways this reflection, this sort of snapshot of where we are that I'll discuss, where I think kind of looking back to my own career, first of all as an architecture student, and then kind of thinking about looking towards the future, is very much driven by actually reflecting on the things that I hear from my students, from the people, the members of the Design Academy Eindhoven community. Because in a way, I think that a lot of the things that we discussed today are generationally almost taken for granted by a different generation. Like the idea that the premise of what we, coming from a certain generation, I'm speaking myself, I graduated in 2003, kind of understand as architecture, I think to some extent has already been replaced. It's already we've already kind of moved beyond that, or at least our students have already moved beyond that. So in a way, I think what we're really trying to do is to reflect a little bit on how this can be something how we can kind of offer some sort of framework for making that not into a sort of a desire that's repressed by our institutions, such as Design Academy or RMIT and so on, but that's actually recognized by those who are in positions of leadership. So I wanted to start from this image, which is actually one of the most reproduced images in history. It's you probably know it as the blue marble. It's an image that was taken in 1972 at a distance of 29,000 kilometers from planet Earth by the crew of the Apollo 17 mission. And the thing that made this image so incredibly unforgettable to us as kind of one of the touchstones of our culture was the fact that it was the first time that the planet Earth was photographed from the outside in its whole. There's a kind of this the overview of our, what Buckminster Fuller, to overquote a little bit more Buckminster Fuller, called Spaceship Earth, this kind of collective vehicle upon which we as a species travel through space. And one of the consequences of this, this photograph was the birth, the kind of definition, the kind of, for the first time, being struck by the overview effect, by the kind of understanding of our condition and the kind of our position within something that's much larger than us, that is the galaxy, and most of all, most importantly, the fragility of the habitat that we occupy. And in the same year, and this may be a coincidence, but I think that in a way the two things are to some extent connected. A group in fact, it was started a couple of years earlier. A group of scientists and researchers at MIT began to kind of think about the way in which we have achieved a level as a species of domination, of technological dominion of this planet, of this spaceship Earth, such that we need to begin to consider the long-term implications of our actions. And the way in which they decided to kind of really begin to kind of unpack and investigate this idea was to put together a research group that could begin to kind of project towards the future these a number of lines, trajectories that involved, I don't know, material production, the consumption of resources, energy requirements, demographic density of cities, demographic growth, and so on, and to begin to consider what that would actually mean if it was kind of projected forward indefinitely. So thinking about these two images really kind of summed up the kind of like thinking, seeing this overview and thinking about what are the consequences of within this kind of closed system led to the publication of this book, The Limits of Growth. And that was really the first time, I think, that one of the most kind of important questions that we as a species have ever had to face was posed to us. The question of what is actually going to happen if one of the kind of fundamental assumptions that underpins our contemporary culture is allowed to be kind of projected, extended into the future indefinitely. And of course, I mean, we're in 1972, we're in a moment of sort of discovery of the possibilities of calculation, of computation, and so obviously this being MIT, there was a natural inclination to feed this into some sort of software, into a computer. I think not so much because any of the calculations were not possible to do by hand, but more because in a way the fact that the outcome was being somehow calculated by a machine gave it an aura of indisputability, something that kind of elevated it beyond even the kind of collective opinion of this group of extremely accomplished scientists. And the result was this, the projection of the kind of levels of growth, the kind of level to which humanity had achieved domination over nature was probably such that the present rate of economic and population growth would probably not last that much beyond 2100, and that from the year 2050 onwards, a certain kind of collapse of this ecosystem would begin. And in order to do this, they examined 5 basic factors, which were food per capita, pollution, industrial output, population, resources, births, and so on, deaths, and began to model what the consequence. I think the thing that was really important about this was the idea of beginning to model these things not individually, but as a system, like how each one of these factors, how the kind of variations would play out between the different factors. And this was really kind of an attempt, I think the first time that there was a question was raised in a moment of towards the end of a moment of extreme optimism. This, Indy referred to it a little bit, this kind of moment of post-war euphoria over the kind of the possibilities of technology, the way in which accelerating technologies could improve the quality of life across for vast numbers of people, that maybe there was a problem, maybe something actually in this model needed to be questioned. And so you can see that there's there's kind of a moment of inflection. In some of these, we're probably kind of somewhere around that right now. And I mean, there was a huge amount of debate around this model. It wasn't kind of taken as a simple kind of truth. But nevertheless, even to this day, it's not exactly clear that it was wrong. There's nothing here that can kind of be disputed, and that that's kind of particularly off track. And so what became incredibly, the combination of these two things from the late 70s, that the early 70s, 1972, this moment in time where it suddenly became clear that this condition of Earth as a closed ecological system was something that needed to be taken into consideration at all levels of human activity. And because a closed ecological system is something that has in fact no kind of energy exchange, material exchange with the outside. I mean, energy, obviously, there's a constant influx of energy coming from our closest star, which is the sun. But if you think about the exchange of matter, of atoms, it's actually kind of incredible to think that every year, 16 tons, exactly 16 tons, I mean, 16 tons is nothing. It's probably like, I don't know, the weight of that sheet glass on that facade of the building. That is the total amount of matter that is being expelled, that is leaving planet Earth for space, never to return. And probably an equivalent amount, more or less, in the form of meteorites and space debris of various kinds is entering. So we're talking about a system that is effectively closed, within which something is happening. There is a dependency has been created upon growth. And this growth is something that we have come to depend on in order for our social structures and our organization, our collective organization as a society and as a community to depends. And so it can become, and that's kind of just to plot it incredibly simply, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a situation upon which, with the passing of time, the size of the economy is growing. It needs to grow. Not only does it need to grow, it needs to grow exponentially. It's actually kind of building, it's a kind of a compound number that's actually building upon itself to accelerate the rate of growth. And if we add these two things up, if we kind of place one on top of the other, it becomes incredibly clear and kind of obvious that these two things are entirely incompatible. It's simply not possible with an enclosed ecological system to support an indefinite growth. And this is something that, you know, there's a lot of debate following the Club of Rome conference, a lot of debate following the publication of Limits to Growth. But the debate was all about the speed, the projections, like whether it was actually going to be 2,100, whether it was going to be a little bit before, or it was going to be a little bit after. There was no debate. It's like, to this day, there is no debate because around the kind of accuracy of the conclusions in projecting this line indefinitely steeper and steeper vertically, to the fact that this, at some point, is going to cause some form of implosion for the simple reason that that is dictated by the laws of thermodynamics. It's like the first law of thermodynamics, that matter can be, that energy can't, it can be transformed, but it can't, it can't be created or destroyed. It can simply be transformed from one form to another. And the same for material. Material will gradually, over a period of time, through a process of entropy, essentially degrade in quality. It'll become a kind of a gunk. Or various kind of forms of compound, but it's actually never going to disappear. It's like we're stuck with it. So as this degradation occurs, and this degradation is something that in nature has always existed, it's one of the fundamental laws of nature. But the fact that we have built a society that is founded on the idea that this degradation needs to be accelerated was a moment of great shock. It was a moment of kind of really kind of realization that we are on a railway track towards a precipice. And I think the thing that's kind of most, that really is most extraordinary about this condition that we've put ourselves in is the fact that nobody can give a good explanation of why this is a good idea. Like, why is this actually something that we collectively want to invest in? It's something that we are, it's pretty clear that we have this collective tendency to, within the kind of social framework, economic framework, productive framework that we've created, to be able to not project ourselves, to not be able to project any sort of long-term horizon into the future. And of course, one of the obvious answers to this is, well, we're an incredibly sophisticated society in technological terms, so we can probably design our way out of this. And this was, I think, especially in the kind of 19th century, when there was the moment of kind of technological acceleration, when there was this moment of really transformation of our society into this model in which we became dependent on perpetual growth. England, 1965-64, was a moment of this really kind of a height of almost creation of a new belief system upon which the economy came to depend. An economist who is called William Stanley Javen actually came up with observing the fact that the coal industry had gradually become increasingly efficient over a period of years, had become really like increasing the acceleration towards the production of the ability to transform coal into useful work, into mechanical labor. Observed the fact that there's a fundamental fallacy in the idea that creating more and more and more efficient machines, that the idea that we can actually kind of design our way out of this problem, for the simple reason that, in fact, and this has come to be known in economics as the Javen's paradox, due to the simple fact that by making more and more efficient machines, we're actually, the result of that is actually to increase demand rather than reduce demand, because obviously in a market economy in which we are taking for granted the fact that none of the externalities produced by the productive process, so in the case of coal, for example, the emission of CO2 into the atmosphere, the cost of the acceleration and efficiency of these machines is actually being paid by nature, by the environment, and rather than being paid for by the end user. So what is essentially the only thing that's becoming more efficient is the ability to offload into, as a kind of a collective, as an externality that's being paid by the whole of society or the whole of humanity, as we can see today, rather than being passed on to the end user. So in all systems where we are kind of become dependent on the idea that we can actually design our way out of the problem by relying on the fact that we can create more and more efficient machines, there is a problem, because we are actually going to, unless we find ways to counterbalance the kind of increase in consequences, increase in externalities, unless that can be somehow added back into the budget sheet, we're going to find that simply the only consequence of all of this is an increase in demand. And in fact, that's something that's been, Indy was talking before about electric cars. One of the things that's been actually noticed in countries that have a high adoption of electric cars is the largest consequence of being much more fuel efficient is that people tend to drive more. And this, I think, so trying to kind of bring this back to architecture, where does this, what does all of this mean for us as designers? This is it's the wool exchange in Bradford that was built shortly after that the Javens wrote the book on the coal question that gave rise to this idea of the Javen's paradox. And shortly before this building was built, John Ruskin was invited to Bradford. John Ruskin at the time was probably the most admired, the most feared art and architecture critic in the UK. And he was invited to Bradford to somehow assist or to, in a way, curate the assignment of this wool exchange to an architect. An architect needed to be selected, so they had to identify one, and everybody was hoping that John Ruskin would kind of give his imprimatur, his stamp of approval to this project and select the most appropriate architect, and therefore kind of make it into somehow an icon of the great, how can you say, prosperity of the city as brought about by the wool exchange. As it turns out, John Ruskin took the opportunity to instead deliver a long monologue that was then later transcribed and became a small publication called Traffic, in which he explained in great detail why he was not in the least bit interested in this project, why he wanted to have nothing to do with the wool exchange. And the reason that he gave, kind of in a nutshell, was that for him, this building, the only thing that was significant about this project and this building, the aspiration to build a new wool mill, wool exchange, was that it was a temple to the goddess of what he described as getting on. And he wanted to have nothing to do with that because that was a dead end, as he could see it, for architecture to become somehow a celebration of simply an acceleration in productive ability and therefore a kind of a collective prosperity that was based on consumption. And I think what's interesting about this, his point in this book, is that architecture is unable to escape from somehow reflecting the bigger picture of what it stands for, the society within which it is produced, the community that erects it. Somehow architecture comes to not just symbolize that, but almost immortalize it, to capture and to reflect and to congeal in a certain moment of time the values of a community. And this is something that to this day I think is an absolute truth of who we are as architects. We are in a way trapped inside a situation where we have no choice but to reflect a series of conditions which we may agree with, we may not agree with, but in which we are somehow compelled to become part of this mechanism of growth, in which we are part of a system that is essentially predicated on an increment in a continuous increment in our productivity. And this is kind of a diagram. Maybe we think that the internal combustion engine is the most important invention of the 19th century. Maybe we think it's the most kind of transformative idea that we have come up with in terms of engines. But I think that that's absolutely not true. The real engine that drives all other engines is the engine of growth. This idea that every single action that we undertake, regulated by the free market, what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of the market, is essentially this. It's not simply about creating a projection, a continuation, an extension of our current wealth towards the future, but unless that wealth is actually growing and increasing, then we are essentially doomed. And that's why a recession technically is actually not when the economy is contracting, but when it stops growing. And we all know how completely terrified we are of the possibility of a recession. So it may kind of not seem completely apparent to us, but within the kind of framework within which we operate as architects, but also within any other profession, the underlying impetus, in a way, is a continuous measurement against this dogma of growth, of perpetual expansion within a closed ecosystem, within a system which we all know very well is simply not capable of supporting that continuous expansion. And the reason why I think that, like I was saying, this is something that touches every kind of activity, every facet of our collective lives, especially within kind of well, especially within free market economies, there is nothing else apart from possibly North Korea that is not a free market economy today, is because construction is such an important part of that. And this is just kind of like looking at Australia specifically, third largest industry in Australia for the number of people it employs, and the share in the GDP, massively important, in fact disproportionately important compared to the number of it's third largest number of people it employs, but actually even larger than that in terms of percentage of probably second largest in terms of revenues. And obviously around this is not just architecture, but it's the entire construction industry. There's a whole number of downstream jobs, downstream supply chains that feed this industry, and therefore, if this sort of imperative of feeding the machine of growth applies to anyone, it's probably most prevalent in the minds of architects. The idea that somehow, when we come out of architecture school, what we've been taught in architecture school is that we need to start building. This is like, if you're not building, if you're not producing, if you're not somehow part of this productive, if you're not immediately finding ways to project into the reality of material space around you your identity, then something's wrong. Then you're essentially on the road to failure. And I think that this is very interesting to kind of look at where this culture, at what point this culture, I think it's been pointed out many times this morning, starting from Uncle Dave through to Indy and really kind of also on to Meiling and so on, that there is somehow, there are many other ways of being a designer that are possible, and yet within architecture school and within the institutions that that have shaped who the designers of today are, there is somehow there's a certain kind of latent idea of what is to be expected of architects, and also of what architects expect from themselves. And I think that in many ways, this image is possibly one of the most powerful in terms of summing up, actually, a certain sort of assumption, an immutable assumption about what an architect represents within society. And this, of course, is the hand of Le Corbusier, photographed in 1924 over Plan Voisin, a plan that he proposed to demolish following World War I, following, obviously we know the condition of Parisian slums in the post-World War I era, the condition of the housing fabric, the condition of urban life at that time. Demolish 2 by 2 square mile plot and build a number of high-rise towers in which offices are concentrated, within which productive activities are concentrated, all built out of concrete, all surrounded by retail within a sea of green, verdant. And this is the new Paris. This is the project that is, in a way, going to become a paradigm for the cities all around the world. And this image, and of course this is something then Corbusier went on to develop much further through Villeradieuse and all sorts of other projects all around the world. But I think that this project was particularly interesting because it was, in a way, the first time that his urban vision was articulated, but also because it was actually the first time that the cards were revealed. And in a way, he was incredibly smart and brilliant in the way in which he was capable of activating 2 parallel channels. One, the narrative of the architect as savior, the architect whose hand hovers over the city, the hand of God. It's actually kind of interesting to think about the position of the hand with respect to Michelangelo's creation. It's really the hand of the architect touching the city, and kind of the city is being begotten by this figure which is so much larger. And therefore, the architect as really kind of the savior of the human condition, the ability to deliver a quality of life that is completely different. And on the other hand, an actual brutal honesty about what the implications were. And if he was actually interviewed about like how he was going to be able to fund this, and his answer was, well, it's going to actually raise the price of real estate by 5 times. And of course, and what about the inhabitants of the slums who were living there before? Well, these troglodytes will be relocated into the suburbs, and that's the end of the story. So you kind of have these two narratives that he was capable of sustaining, not just at that moment and relatively unquestioned, but for the rest of his career, the rest of his life. And that's something that, of course, really becomes part of the package, the identity of the architect as it came to be understood, and that I think is really captured incredibly well by Gary Cooper in the interpretation of Fountainhead, Howard Rourke, the heroic architect. This image could, in fact, be the kind of the counterpoint to the previous image. It could be Howard Rourke's hand looking down on the city, hovering over it. And I think it's difficult to overstate the extent to which this idea of the architect as savior really became a paradigm. It became something that kind of deeply permeated our culture as architects, and carried with it a whole number of connotations and kind of parallel ideas. One of which was so this idea of the architect as purveyor of modernity, democracy, liberator, growth, but also of concrete. So if we kind of look at this material specifically, which I think is just one of many threads through which we could sort of unpack this paradigm that's represented by Le Corbusier, Howard Rourke, the REM hope model, is this idea of attachment to a specific material, the promise of a specific material, which in this case is concrete, and which, of course, the creation of Plan Voisin, Ville Radieuse as a paradigm that is to be replicated elsewhere, is to become kind of a model, a template. Of course, we know how that played out, but that's just, in a way, the beginning of the problems of this model. A dependency on a certain material that was extremely seductive, extremely efficient within a certain framework, within a certain kind of idea. But then, as we know, actually kind of turned out to be possibly the most catastrophic move that any architect could possibly have made, was to introduce concrete into the global bloodstream and make it into something that we could become, that we did effectively become reliant on. But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end with CO2 emissions, because when we start to really kind of look at the list of externalities that this single material, and I mean there are many that we could take, as we know that concrete is obviously one of the worst, but looking at, for example, concrete's reliance on sand. Sand after water is actually the most widely depleted material at a planetary scale. And this particular image of river erosion on the Mekong River near Ho Chi Minh City is a perfect example of the ways in which externalities operate within the global supply chains of architecture. They're really kind of the scale, the distance, the removal is extreme, but it doesn't even end there, because then, of course, these have secondary consequences, like the whole culture of depletion around this, the industry that's born around this, the scarcity that comes when these materials start to run out, has all sorts of secondary order consequences, such as wars even erupting around sand, or the depletion of of beaches in Morocco and so on. And all of this is something that is actually kind of somehow institutionalized within the architecture programs, within the model that we put forward to students to aspire towards a certain idea. And in a way, this image, I think, captures it incredibly well, which is why we put on the cover of non-extractive architecture, which is Mies van der Rohe's kind of celebration of this act of extraction, the kind of use of nature in a compositional way that frames it really like a painting, but that completely somehow immortalizes this idea that nature is there, free for the taking, and can somehow become unquestioningly a support for our productive activity as a profession. And this is really something that runs so incredibly deep, not just within architecture, but to all the way from Malthus to Charles Darwin, this idea that somehow there is something good about this selfish gene, about the idea of savage depletion, that this is something that's actually necessary for the survival of society. Of course, that's actually probably right within a growth-based economy, but as soon as we begin to look at the consequences of that, of the extreme nature of this, of taking these ideas to the extreme, it becomes extremely problematic. And this is why an alternative paradigm is so incredibly important and urgently needed. And the project, non-extractive architecture, was in many ways the consequence of having, by complete chance, come across this book by Tim Jackson, which is, I think the title says it all, Prosperity Without Growth. Like, can we actually question this idea that depletion is necessary? Is it something that's kind of so deeply embedded within our productive model that no alternative is possible? Or could we actually think about a different model? And I think this is an incredibly interesting and important book that I think is urgently needed reading in more or less any field. But the thesis of the book is essentially that we need to find a way to transition away from the hydrocarbon intensive activities that are so disproportionately damaging to the environment, and construction, mining, utilities, even agriculture are really good examples of that. And services and personal services, distribution, so on, are a completely different model. And his idea, his definition of prosperity without growth rests primarily on redefining what we mean by prosperity. And I think that this is the kind of the fundamental point. Like, how do we actually kind of alter the goals of what we do such that we can be aiming towards an idea of prosperity that is actually possible to sustain, rather than one that is essentially kind of putting us on the path to destruction. Yeah, after Bucky Fuller, probably Cedric Price is the second most overquoted. Dan Hill and I have a kind of an informal competition who can stick him into more lectures. But I think the point of this is a fundamental point. Like, how do we actually rethink what our goals are, rather than defaulting to this idea that construction is necessary? And this was really when we were invited by VAC to spend some time in Venice and to kind of reflect on a certain topic. This was why the idea of non-extractive architecture seemed so kind of incredibly interesting to look at in that specific space, to kind of really take this idea of a new definition of prosperity, and begin to unpack what that means for architecture. And this is a quick sketch that Dan was one of the first people I spoke to about this project, and he had this beautiful way of talking about this in relation to Venice, which is a city of stone built on trees, that essentially we need to rewind to a city which is made of renewable resources that leaves the stone where it came from. And the Volume 1 of non-extractive architecture was actually done during lockdown. We had intended to make it into the sort of the culmination of this first year of research. It ended up being the other way around, where during lockdown we actually spent some time trying to think about what could be a framework for organizing some of the sort of fundamental principles of a rethinking of the architectural profession. Like, how can we actually completely rewind to the point where a new paradigm can be really kind of going back to first principles, like taking nothing for granted, no assumptions, like actually really sort of attempting to think the unthinkable and question every single kind of point of the way. And The book, I have a copy here actually, I'll leave it out afterwards so anybody wants to take a quick look, but just very quickly, some of the kind of the key points that emerge from this and that somehow also shaped the project. The first being language. The idea that one of the things that we were trying to deal with was the fact that language is so incredibly important, but it's also, in a way, one of the most it's one of the kind of points of crisis within architecture today, because the word sustainability has become so incredibly threadbare that we just, essentially, I mean, you'd have to really kind of go deep into a rabbit hole of decoupling, in absolute decoupling, relative decoupling. What we actually mean by this word is so, completely depending on context, so distorted and instrumentalized, often for the purpose of selling, that it's essentially become useless. And so the first stage was to really begin to try to to equip ourselves with a set of words that could somehow be a little bit more specific and precise. And that's where the idea of talking about, instead of talking about sustainable architecture, trying to talk about non-extractive architecture, or trying to talk about designing without depletion. Like, is this actually something that is possible, or is it something that we're somehow condemned to continue? And that then led on, in fact, to a lot of other conversations that I think have really been already kind of, we've gone quite into some detail on that, the idea of development actually possibly needing to become something much more like stewardship. The role of the architect, which we so kind of instantly associate in our minds to the organization of space. What about time? What if nobody's thinking about the long-term view? What if we actually completely abandon the question of space and we really kind of began to focus on the idea of time? The problem of complexity, the fact that our buildings have become so unbelievably complex that it's completely impossible to trace in any way the origin, or to be able to control the origin of any of these, any of the single components, and just kind of looking at how this is something that's actually a consequence of extended supply chains that have made it possible to source materials from the other side of the world, where it's much more difficult to have any sort of control over the quality of components, the health levels that are associated with the long-term cohabitation with those components, the externalities that are being created by their production. Invisibility. Supply chains are obviously something that are problematic, not simply because of the consequences for the places of origin, but because they make invisible to us, and this, one could argue, is actually kind of the primary purpose of the supply chain, is not necessarily simply to connect us to resources that are not available where we are, but to actually disconnect us from the consequences of the extraction of those materials. So the supply chain as a mechanism of the creation of invisibility, of removal, is, I think, possibly the most significant invention of the 20th century, and also kind of produces amazing images like this logjam of empty ships attempting to get back to Asia during the Suez Canal crisis. And yeah, the creation of an absence in our minds of any sort of awareness or understanding of the productive geographies that are underlying our cities. And so I think it's really interesting to think about this in a way as a form of urbanism, like the cities that we live in. This is the counterpart, and yet we don't talk about this, we don't think about it. There's something that's kind of completely distant and removed and erased from our consciousness. Inequality, the fact that, in fact, when we talk about extraction, when we talk about a dependency we're very often talking about labor. We're not simply talking about materials. So I think we could equally talk about, we're talking about material flows in this conference, but we could equally be talking about architecture's, a certain model of architecture's dependency on inequality. And in general, this is, rather low-res photo of a beach in Morocco that's been completely stripped of sand in order to feed the productive the production of urban space, essentially, for it to become concrete. Because the thing that's, I think, little understood also is that sand is not something, the grade of sand that's needed to produce concrete for buildings is not the kind of sand that you find in the Sahara Desert. It's actually typically found on riverbeds. It's a very kind of specific kind of sand. And so these are all kind of topics that we attempted to unpack in greater detail through the book. A few essays that I'd shout out are Luke Jones' Carbon Tectonic, an incredibly interesting investigation of a certain kind of the idea of architecture as, in a way, a marketplace of carbon. An exchange, examination of the flows, also informed very much by Jane's work. Between productive landscapes of the forest and elsewhere, and so on. I mean, I'll bring the copy out afterwards and you can take a look. But I think the fundamental idea that emerged from this is, from the series of reflections and conversations of Volume 1, was the kind of collective misunderstanding. We've talked a lot about the misunderstanding that what architects do, and the kind of misplaced assumption about architects of themselves. But I think the most important thing is a misunderstanding of what actually needs to be done. We don't need to make more efficient buildings. That's not the point. The point is we need to fundamentally rethink, like really kind of rewind to step one about and examine what it means to build in such a way that we're not simply offloading the consequences of our actions onto someone else, somewhere else. Very briefly, just kind of like flipping through, the exhibition in Venice was also really, this year of research was an attempt to build something that was a bit like kind of a hybrid between a workshop, an exhibition, a research lab, all rolled into one, in which we were also kind of really trying to redefine what it means to make an architecture exhibition. A lot of experimentation happening on site. We made a point of making of doing a lot of material experimentation on site, because the point being that if you can do this, including the production of samples of dowel laminated timber, if you can do this inside a palazzo in Venice, then more or less you can do it anywhere. And then the I think the kind of the most significant output of this being ultimately a network. And I think we see ourselves as designers of networks, of situations of encounter, of bringing people together and kind of creating somehow a movement more than anything else. And I think, just to kind of conclude, I think that if we really needed to think of a kind of a counterpoint to Howard Rourke, to the hand of Le Corbusier over the city, I think it's really incredibly exciting to think about a figure like Uncle Dave, who took us yesterday morning, on a incredibly beautiful walk, and kind of demonstrated a granular knowledge of the landscape that is really something that is completely absent from the architectural curriculum today. And what if we were to really rethink this idea of the architect? So it's been said many times today, to the point it doesn't really need to be stated again, but as the idea of taking care, being responsible for a community, for a landscape, for a fragment of earth somewhere. It's just such an incredibly beautiful and exciting thing, and really kind of understanding where materials come from, where they go to, and so on. I'm just going to show super briefly, because I've run over time. We, in our work, attempt to we do a lot of kind of relatively short workshop-based projects that somehow attempt to test whether these ideas are actually viable. And one of these was just like 2 weeks ago, inaugurated, was a small project for Terraform, a music festival based in Milan, that looked at the possibility of actually going to the source of materials and also using materials that are the consequence of extreme weather conditions. So this is a storm that took place in 2018 in northern Italy that actually completely wiped out 800,000 hectares of woodland, and created an incredible surplus of wood, which would have rotted if it hadn't been taken away. So the community went to a great, made a very significant investment in storing all of this wood, but unless they're able to, they had to get loans from the bank to be able to kind of transport it off-site and so on, and therefore really need to use this wood as quickly as possible. So what was most interesting, I mean, the project itself was simple, it was a stage, but being able to go to the place of origin and to really kind of speak to the people who had taken care of collecting this material and had kind of spoken, and then kind of creating a workshop situation around the production of this structure was incredibly exciting. And it's just like it would be so exciting if architectural projects could be more like that, could be more about a community coming together to produce something in which there was a real connection to the place of origin. And these are a few photos of the final project installed. And then, just as a very last one, I just wanted to very briefly just show you another project that was inaugurated just last week at Triennale. Was a direct outcome of the research in Venice, looking at the ways in which some of the oldest techniques of building and some of the newest could be combined usefully in a way that could produce new forms, but in a way that is also kind of has useful consequences environmentally. And exhibitions, as we know, can be one of the most damaging, one of the most wasteful in terms of the production of displays that typically get thrown away. There are two ways you can go around that problem. One is to attempt to reuse the display systems, or the other is to just use a material that's universally available. And together with WASP, which is an incredible Italian company that's a world leader in production of architectural scale 3D printers, and Rice House, which is a company that looks at how really poor materials like mud can be really used at an architectural scale thanks to byproducts of the food industry, such as binders derived from rice husks. It's possible to begin to produce quite sophisticated forms that actually have incredible structural integrity. So this was actually really an experiment in kind of we'd done a lot of tests in Venice on a very small scale. In Milan, we began to scale this up to the scale of an exhibition display system and printed on-site inside Triennale, moving the printer through the space, all of these displays, which at the end of the exhibition will be it was really like a construction site. I mean, it was like a really kind of hardcore, really like much closer to a building site than typically an exhibition display was. But the result was that the product at the end of all of this can actually be returned to the fields just outside Milan, which is where all of this earth came from in the first place. And I think it's obviously, I think this is a very early test, and what we're trying to do now is to really look at how this can be scaled up to something much larger and become another tool in the arsenal of architects. Access to tools, access to ideas that can be much more useful at a local relevant scale. Thank you very much.